My name is Savannah, and I am 33 years old. I never expected to be the villain in my family's perfect social narrative. But I also never expected them to publicly humiliate me in front of 400 of Chicago's wealthiest elites. At my sister's wedding reception, the massive projector screen suddenly lit up with bright red letters. It read, "Infertile, divorced, failure, high school dropout, broke, alone." The entire ballroom erupted in vicious laughter. My sister smirked into the microphone and said, "Do not laugh too hard, everyone, she might actually cry." My mother just swirled her wine and my father told me it was just a joke. I reached for my phone and typed exactly one single word. Begin. The room went completely dead silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your true worth. The evening began exactly as my mother Catherine had orchestrated it. The Grand Chicago Ballroom was draped in white silk and imported orchids. My younger sister Felicity was 29 and practically glowing in her custom designer gown. I was seated at the far end of the head table, placed there merely for the optics of family unity. I wore a simple black dress, blending into the shadows, while my parents paraded Felicity around like a trophy. But tonight was supposed to be a celebration of love. I had come with a genuine desire to support my sister, despite our complicated past. I sat quietly eating my dinner and clapping politely during the initial speeches. I endured the sidelong glances from my aunts and uncles who viewed me as the family disappointment. I had accepted my role long ago just to keep the peace. I honestly thought that if I stayed quiet, my family would simply ignore me as they usually did. I was terribly wrong. The lights dimmed for the maid of honor speech. Felicity stood up and grabbed the microphone with a theatrical sigh. She announced that she wanted to do something a little different before the main toasts began. She said she had prepared a special presentation to highlight how blessed she was to be starting this new chapter of her life. The massive projector screen slowly lowered from the high ceiling. A soft, romantic melody began to play through the expensive sound system. The 400 guests turned their attention to the front of the room, expecting baby photos and touching childhood memories. Instead, the screen flashed blindingly white. An unflattering, highly distorted photograph of me appeared on the massive display. It was a picture from 5 years ago, taken right after my divorce was finalized. My eyes were red and swollen. My hair was a mess. Above my face in huge bold red letters were the words that would supposedly define my entire existence. Infertile, divorced, failure, high school dropout, broke, alone. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed immediately by a wave of cruel laughter. 400 people wearing expensive tuxedos and designer ball gowns were pointing and laughing at my pain. I looked at the head table. Felicity was smiling brightly, showing off her perfectly whitened teeth. She spoke directly into the microphone, ensuring her voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. "Let us all raise a glass to my big sister Savannah," she announced to the crowd. "She serves as the perfect reminder of everything I never want to be. Do not laugh too hard. Everyone, she might actually cry and ruin the expensive silk on these rented chairs." The cruelty of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I turned my gaze to my mother. Catherine took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive red wine. She looked at me with a complacent, satisfied expression, as if she had just watched a masterpiece unfold. She did not say a single word to defend me. She simply enjoyed the spectacle. I looked at my father Thomas, hoping for a sliver of parental protection. He leaned back in his chair, chuckled out loud, and patted Felicity on the back affectionately. "Stop being so sensitive, Savannah," he said loudly. "Take a joke for once in your life. You always ruin the mood with your constant negativity." I sat there completely motionless. The music swelled again, playing a mockingly cheerful tune as the horrible slide remained projected on the screen. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or run out of the room like they expected me to. I just stared at the glowing red letters on the screen, analyzing every single word they had used to describe me. Dropout. The truth was, I did not drop out of high school because I was lazy. I was forced to leave. When I was 17, I discovered that my father, Thomas, had secretly drained my entire college savings account. Every penny I had earned and every dollar my grandparents had left me was entirely gone. He used it to pay for Felicity's beauty pageants, her designer wardrobes, and his own failing supply chain business. When I confronted them, my parents coldly told me I was not smart enough for college anyway, and that I needed to get a full-time job to contribute to the household expenses. I worked 3 minimum wage jobs just to survive. Broke. While they spent the last decade polishing their fake wealthy image and drowning in hidden debt, I was quietly building an empire. I earned my general equivalency diploma in absolute secret. I taught myself advanced coding late at night on a broken laptop. I secured a full scholarship to an Ivy League university and graduated at the very top of my class. I never told them about my academic success because I knew they would just try to take credit for it or find a way to steal my earnings. Over the next 10 years, I built Vanguard Acquisitions from the ground up. It is now a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm with global influence. I am the sole founder and the majority shareholder. Divorced and infertile. Yes, my ex-husband Cameron left me when we found out we could not easily have children. My family sided with him completely because he was a supposedly successful tech entrepreneur. They told me I was a useless wife who could not even provide a family. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one who wrote the foundational code for his startup while working nights to pay our rent. They had no idea I was quietly waiting for the exact right moment to legally reclaim what was rightfully mine. And the most amusing part of Felicity's little speech was her arrogant comment about the rented chairs. She had absolutely no clue that my holding company had purchased this entire luxury venue 3 months ago. The laughter in the room began to subside as people returned to their expensive meals and wine. Felicity handed the microphone back to the best man, looking incredibly pleased with her flawless performance. My parents went back to chatting with the wealthy guests at the adjacent tables, completely ignoring my presence. They thought they had finally put me in my place once and for all. I reached into my small black clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my calm, steady face in the dim lighting. I opened my messages and scrolled to the contact for Declan, my highly trusted Chief Operations Officer. I typed exactly one single bold word. Begin. I hit send and placed the phone face down on the crisp white tablecloth. I picked up my champagne flute and took a slow, deliberate sip, waiting for the dominoes to fall. 10 seconds passed in relative normalcy. Then the atmosphere in the room shifted violently. A loud, heavy magnetic clack echoed through the massive ballroom. The 4 heavy double doors at the entrances and exits locked simultaneously, sealing everyone inside. The cheerful background music cut out completely, leaving a ringing, tense silence in its wake. The decorative uplighting along the walls switched off, plunging the perimeter of the room into absolute darkness. Only the bright spotlights illuminating the head table remained on, trapping my family in a harsh, blinding glare. Whispers of confusion broke out among the 400 guests. Felicity looked intensely annoyed, her perfect smile slipping as she tapped the best man on the shoulder to ask what was wrong. My father stood up, looking toward the back of the room with an authoritative scowl, ready to yell at the staff. Before he could shout a demand, the heavy doors near the kitchen swung open. The venue general manager, a very stern and serious man in a tailored suit, marched directly down the center aisle. 2 large security guards flanked him, moving with purposeful speed. He did not look at the confused guests. He did not look at my parents. He marched straight up onto the elevated stage, ignoring the best man completely in his path. The general manager reached out and yanked the microphone directly from the stand. The loud screech of audio feedback made several guests cover their ears in pain. He turned to face the head table, his eyes fixed firmly on my sister and the groom. The night of celebrating my failures was officially over. The execution of my corporate takeover had just begun. The room fell completely silent. Mr. Sterling, the general manager, stood tall at the center of the stage. He adjusted his suit jacket, looking down at the head table with absolute professional disdain. Felicity stared at him, her mouth opening and closing in shock. She reached for the microphone, but Mr. Sterling stepped back easily out of her reach. He tapped the microphone twice. The sharp thuds echoed through the massive ballroom, forcing every single one of the 400 elite guests to sit up straight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Sterling said, his voice booming deep and entirely unwavering, "I apologize for the abrupt interruption to this evening festivities. However, a critical administrative issue has just been brought to my immediate attention." Felicity crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets catching the harsh spotlight. She demanded to know what he was doing and threatened to have him fired immediately. Mr. Sterling did not even blink. He looked down at her with cold indifference. "Miss Vance," he said, using her maiden name, which made her visibly flinch. "As of exactly 2 minutes ago, the anonymous corporate benefactor who subsidized this entire event has officially revoked their massive financial funding today." A wave of dramatic gasps rolled through the crowd. My mother, Catherine, stood up from her chair, her silk evening gown rustling loudly in the quiet room. She demanded to know what he was talking about, claiming that the wedding was fully paid for and secure. Mr. Sterling pulled a crisp, folded document from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. The subsidy contained a very specific morality and conduct clause. He read aloud from the paper. "It states that any public display of harassment, defamation, or targeted humiliation toward any guest will result in immediate financial termination entirely." The display we just witnessed on that projector was a direct and blatant violation. I took another slow sip of my champagne, letting the crisp liquid cool my throat. I watched my family scramble to process the information. They had spent months bragging to their country club friends about this $250,000 wedding, letting everyone assume they were footing the bill. They never questioned why the venue had miraculously offered them a massive anonymous corporate grant. They were too greedy and arrogant to look a gift horse in the mouth. Now the trap was springing shut on their necks. Mr. Sterling signaled to one of his security guards standing by the stairs. The guard stepped forward and handed him a thick black leather folder. Mr. Sterling walked directly over to the groom. Spencer sat there looking like a deer caught in the headlights of a freight train. "The total cost of this evening venue rental, catering, premium floral arrangements, and staff overtime amounts to exactly $250,000, Mr. Sterling announced. He dropped the heavy leather folder right onto Spencer's dinner plate, nearly knocking over his red wine glass. "The balance is due immediately right now. If a valid form of payment is not provided right now, I will order the staff to clear the tables, the power will be cut, and I will have the Chicago Police Department waiting outside to arrest you for theft of services." Felicity let out a shrill, panicked shriek. She grabbed Spencer by the arm, shaking him frantically. She told him to just pay the man so they could get back to the reception and save face. This was the moment I had been waiting for all night. My parents had spent the last 2 years worshipping Spencer completely blindly. They constantly reminded me that Spencer was a brilliant, wealthy tech heir who came from old money. They used his supposed massive net worth as a weapon to mock my own failed marriage. Catherine loved to corner me at family dinners and loudly whisper how Felicity had secured a billionaire, while I could not even keep a mid-level software developer interested. They loved Spencer because he represented the fake elitist image they craved. But I knew the actual truth about Spencer. My investigative team at Vanguard had dug into his background months ago, discovering his real financial situation totally. He was nothing but a charismatic fraud drowning in leveraged debt and hollow promises. Spencer puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his arrogant facade in front of the 400 guests, watching his every move. He scoffed loudly, adjusting his designer tie. He told Mr. Sterling that this was highly unprofessional and that he would be leaving a terrible review that would ruin the venue. But the threat of the police clearly terrified him. His hands were visibly shaking as he reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a sleek designer wallet and aggressively slapped a premium, heavy metal black credit card onto the table. "Run it," Spencer commanded, trying to sound bored and unbothered, "and add a 10% tip for your incredible lack of hospitality." Mr. Sterling did not react to the insult. He simply reached into his pocket and produced a mobile payment terminal. He picked up the heavy black card and slid it through the machine. The ballroom held its collective breath. A few seconds passed in agonizing silence. A loud, obnoxious beep echoed from the terminal. A bright red light flashed on the small screen. Mr. Sterling looked down calmly today. "Declined," he stated clearly. Spencer's face flushed a deep crimson red. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He quickly snatched the card back, stammering about a random fraud alert. He claimed his bank must have frozen the card because of the unusually large late-night charge. He fumbled with his wallet again and pulled out a second premium credit card, this one tied to his supposed tech startup. He shoved it toward Mr. Sterling. "Use this one and hurry up because you are ruining my wedding." Mr. Sterling swiped the second card without a single expression. The machine processed the electronic request. Another loud rejection beep filled the silent room. "Decline," Mr. Sterling repeated, his voice echoing off the high walls. The atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. The guests who had been viciously laughing at my expense just 5 minutes ago were now turning their sharp, judgmental eyes onto the bride and groom. I could hear the whispers starting to ripple through the tables. People were murmuring about Spencer's fake watch. They were gossiping about his leased sports car. The elite socialites my parents so desperately wanted to impress were now smelling blood here tonight. Sweat began to bead on Spencer's forehead. His confident posture completely collapsed. He frantically dug into his wallet and pulled out a third card, a personal platinum credit card. His hands were shaking so badly, he dropped it on the floor before snatching it up and thrusting it at the manager. "Try it again," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "The machine must be broken. Do you know who my family is? Just run the card." Mr. Sterling remained as cold as ice. He swiped the third card. The longest 3 seconds of Spencer life ticked by in front of everyone. The terminal let out a final, definitive rejection tone. The red light flashed brighter than before. "Declined," Mr. Sterling announced to the entire room. "Sir, you have no available credit. If you do not have another form of payment, I am calling the authorities right now." Felicity burst into tears. Real, panicked, ugly tears. Her perfect makeup began to run down her face, ruining her flawless bridal look. She screamed at Spencer, demanding to know what was going on and why his infinite wealth was suddenly gone. Spencer could not even look her in the eye. He just stared blankly. At the table, his mouth open, completely humiliated in front of the entire Chicago high society. This was far too much for my father to bear. Thomas could not stand the thought of his wealthy friends watching his family face public financial ruin. He pushed his chair back violently, the wood scraping loudly against the polished floor. He marched over to Spencer and shoved him out of the way. "Enough of this nonsense," Thomas barked, his chest puffed out in a display of manufactured authority. Thomas reached into his pocket and proudly pulled out his own personal corporate credit card. "Charge the full amount to my corporate account," Thomas ordered loudly. I watched Mr. Sterling pick up my father card. The general manager knew exactly what was about to happen because he had been briefed by my team. Mr. Sterling swiped the card through the terminal. The machine let out a sharp, continuous, high-pitched alarm. The screen displayed a solid, bright crimson warning block. "The terminal indicates that this account has been seized by federal authorities," Mr. Sterling said. Suddenly, my father's cell phone rang. Thomas answered. Thomas, the chief financial officer, screamed. "The feds just froze our accounts." Thomas's phone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the pristine white tablecloth. The chief financial officer's frantic voice continued to echo from the small speaker, shouting about federal agents and seized assets. But Thomas was entirely paralyzed. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. The 400 elite guests in the ballroom began to whisper furiously. The sound resembled a swarm of angry bees filling the cavernous space with a thick, suffocating tension. The venue manager, Mr. Sterling, stood immovable on the stage, his hands still extended toward Spencer, holding the leather billfolder like a weapon. The silence that followed the dropped phone was heavy and humiliating. Felicity could not handle the shift in attention. Her perfect day was unraveling in front of Chicago's highest society, and the desperate need to save face overwhelmed her panic. She shoved her chair back and grabbed her diamond-encrusted smartphone from the table. She practically shoved Spencer out of the way, marching right up to the edge of the stage to confront the venue manager. She told Mr. Sterling to back off, claiming that her father's corporate account issue was just a minor banking glitch and that she did not need his money anyway. She loudly announced to the entire ballroom that she and Spencer had a massive private honeymoon fund. She had been bragging about this exact fund for over a year, posting constant updates about their upcoming month-long tour of private villas in the Maldives and five-star resorts in Bora Bora. She had mocked me just last week for taking a staycation, telling me that successful people traveled the globe while failures stayed home. She held her phone up like a shield, boldly declaring that there was over $100,000 sitting in high-yield liquid cash. She swiped her screen aggressively, opening her banking application to transfer the funds directly to the venue. She promised the manager she would wire the entire $250,000 balance right there on the spot. But as her manicured finger tapped the screen, her confident sneer instantly vanished. Her eyes widened in absolute horror. She tapped the screen again, harder and faster, frantically pulling down to refresh the page. The banking app loaded with crystal clarity. The account balance displayed in bold black numbers was $0.00. Felicity let out a strangled gasp. She shook the phone as if the physical motion could magically conjure the missing fortune. She logged out and logged back in her hands, trembling so violently she dropped her phone onto the polished wooden dance floor. The screen cracked diagonally, but the display remained lit, broadcasting the zero balance for anyone nearby to see. Spencer scrambled to pick it up, his own face contorting in panic as he verified the empty account. The guests in the front row were openly staring, now their previous admiration replaced by harsh, judgmental scrutiny. The elite circle my parents had spent decades cultivating was watching their golden child completely fall apart. Unable to process the reality of her own financial ruin, Felicity reverted to her oldest and most reliable defense mechanism. She looked for someone else to blame. Her frantic eyes darted around the room and landed directly on me. I was still sitting quietly at the far end of the head table, completely unbothered by the chaos erupting around me. Felicity marched toward me, her custom silk wedding gown dragging heavily on the floor. Her face was twisted with irrational fury. She pointed a shaking finger right at my face and screamed at the top of her lungs. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage, completely destroying the delicate bridal aesthetic she had spent all morning crafting with her elite glam squad. She blamed me for bringing my dark cloud into her perfect venue. She shouted that I was a jinx, a miserable failure, who infected everyone around me with bad luck. She told the entire room that this was exactly why my ex-husband Cameron had dumped me, because my toxic energy destroyed everything successful. She screamed that my presence had somehow cursed the banking servers. She demanded that security throw me out immediately, claiming my pathetic broke energy was ruining the most important day of her life. My mother Catherine chimed in right on cue, finding her voice now that she had a target. She ordered me to leave, stating that my bitter jealousy over Felicity's billionaire groom was clearly causing a scene. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I calmly stood up from my chair, smoothing the fabric of my simple black dress. I reached for the chilled bottle of vintage champagne resting in the silver bucket on the table. The sound of the glass bottle clinking against my crystal flute rang out sharply in the tense quiet of the room. I poured myself a fresh glass, taking my time, ensuring the pour was perfectly measured. I took a slow sip, savoring the expensive taste, before I finally spoke. My voice was completely calm, projecting clearly across the silent ballroom without the need for a microphone. I told Felicity that bad luck had absolutely nothing to do with her empty bank account. I set the champagne glass down and looked directly into her terrified eyes. I asked her if she truly believed a high school dropout was stupid enough to never check her own credit report. The color instantly drained from Felicity's face. Her aggressive posture crumbled into defensive terror. I took a slow step forward, making sure my voice carried to the front rows of the audience. I revealed the ugly truth they had buried for years. I explained to the captivated crowd that the magnificent honeymoon fund was not built on Spencer's tech money or my father's corporate bonuses. The entire fund was tied directly to a massive line of credit that Felicity had fraudulently opened 5 years ago. I laid out the exact details. While my family was busy mocking my modest lifestyle and telling their friends I was a financial failure, Felicity had stolen my social security number. She used my identity to secure premium credit lines to fund her designer handbags, her luxury vacations, and her entire fake influencer aesthetic. She had racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt under my name, betting that I would never have the resources or the intelligence to discover the identity theft. She assumed I was exactly the ignorant, broke failure they constantly projected on that projector screen. Catherine gasped loudly, clutching her pearl necklace. She tried to step between us, demanding I stop lying and stop embarrassing the family with these wild accusations. She insisted Felicity would never do something so criminal, and that I was just a bitter, jealous older sister making up stories to ruin a beautiful wedding. Thomas finally found his voice, threatening to have me sued for defamation if I said another word. I simply smiled at them, the kind of cold, clinical smile that completely disarms bullies. I turned my attention back to my trembling sister. I explained that the text message I sent earlier, the single word begin, was not just a signal to the venue manager to cut the corporate subsidy. That text was a synchronized global directive. The moment I hit send, my private legal team at Vanguard Acquisitions executed a flawlessly prepared strike. They officially filed the identity theft reports with the federal authorities and the major credit bureaus simultaneously. I had been tracking her fraudulent accounts for months, quietly building an ironclad forensic portfolio of every single illegal transaction she made. I waited for this exact day, this exact hour to pull the trigger. The bank received the certified federal fraud injunction exactly 2 minutes ago. They did not just freeze her precious honeymoon fund. They seized every single fraudulent asset tied to my stolen identity. She had $0 because she never actually had any money to begin with. She was a hollow shell living on stolen time and stolen credit. The ballroom erupted into a deafening roar of shocked whispers and absolute disbelief. The wealthy guests who had praised Felicity's fashion sense and luxurious lifestyle were now looking at her like she was a common thief. The illusion of the golden child was completely shattered. Felicity backed away from me, shaking her head in denial, tears of absolute panic streaming down her face. She looked at Spencer, pleading with him to tell everyone it was a lie, to use his vast wealth to fix the situation and prove I was crazy. But Spencer was not looking at her. He was staring at the locked double doors at the back of the ballroom. The heavy magnetic locks disengaged with a loud, echoing clank. The thick wooden doors were pushed open forcefully from the outside, breaking the seal on the room. 2 tall, uniformed police officers strode purposefully into the ballroom. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path for the authorities. Catherine let out a sharp cry, running toward the officers. She frantically pointed at me, demanding they arrest me for hacking her daughter's bank accounts and ruining the wedding. She yelled that I was a deranged dropout who was terrorizing their elite family. The police officers did not even look at my mother. They completely ignored her hysterical demands. They bypassed me without a single glance. They marched straight past the crying bride and the stunned father of the bride. They walked directly up to the groom. Spencer took a step backward, his hands raised in a futile gesture of surrender. The lead officer grabbed Spencer by the shoulder and spun him around, forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed over the silent crowd. The officer read him his rights in a clear, booming voice, announcing that Spencer was being placed under arrest for multiple counts of interstate wire fraud and grand larceny. Felicity screamed, falling to her knees on the polished dance floor as they dragged her new husband away in handcuffs. The sun rose over the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor of my apartment. It was a modest one-bedroom unit on the 10th floor. The walls were simple white, and the furniture was practical. To anyone looking from the outside, it was the exact apartment a high school dropout would rent. My family constantly mocked my living situation. They loved reminding me that a woman my age should live in a sprawling suburban estate, not a tiny box in the city. They had absolutely no idea that I actually owned the entire luxury high-rise building. I chose this unit simply because I valued privacy over flashy displays of wealth. I stood by the kitchen island pouring myself a cup of dark roast coffee. The morning silence was a stark contrast to the wedding chaos 12 hours prior. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in my chest. My mind was perfectly at peace today. The peace was violently shattered by frantic pounding on my front door. Before I could even set my coffee mug down, the door flew open. I had given my mother a spare key years ago for emergencies, and she clearly decided today qualified. Catherine stormed into my apartment looking completely different than the polished matriarch from the night before. Her designer makeup was heavily smudged, and her hair was disheveled. Thomas followed close behind her, his face red and slick with sweat. He was still wearing his tuxedo trousers with his tie thrown over his shoulder. Trailing behind them was Felicity, looking like a ghost. Her eyes were swollen and bloodshot from crying all night. She was wrapped in an oversized trench coat, clutching her designer purse as if it were a life preserver. They did not wipe their shoes. They marched into my living room, treating my space with absolute disrespect. Thomas did not bother to say good morning. He slammed his fist down on my kitchen counter, making my coffee mug rattle. He demanded I pick up my phone and call Cameron right this second. The sound of my ex-husband name hanging in the air made the room feel instantly colder. He was practically foaming at the mouth with sheer desperation. Thomas paced across my living room floor, barking orders. He explained Spencer was sitting in a federal holding cell, and his bail was set at a staggering amount. Furthermore, the federal freeze on Thomas' corporate accounts meant his supply chain company could not make payroll this week. He yelled that he needed a massive injection of liquid cash by noon, or his legacy would be wiped off the map. Catherine stepped forward, pointing her manicured finger directly at my chest. She told me this was my mess to clean up completely, ignoring the fact that Felicity was the one who committed federal wire fraud. In Catherine Twisted Reality, my decision to stop paying for their luxurious facade was the real crime. She said I owed them this favor because I had been a constant source of embarrassment for the last decade. Felicity chimed in, glaring at me with absolute pure hatred. She told me Cameron was a wildly successful tech founder who had millions in disposable income. She threw my past trauma right in my face, reminding me that Cameron had divorced me because I was infertile and lacked any ambition. She said a man like Cameron needed a wife who could give him a family and keep up with his elite social circle, not a barren dropout who worked dead-end jobs. Catherine leaned in close to my face, stating this was my only chance to finally prove I was useful to this family. She said if I swallowed my pride and begged Cameron for a corporate loan, I could redeem myself for being such a monumental failure. She insisted Cameron would surely throw me a few $1,000,000 out of sheer pity if I cried and played the victim. They wanted me to humiliate myself in front of the man who emotionally destroyed me, just to maintain their fake wealthy lifestyle. I watched them unravel in my living room, realizing just how pathetic they truly were. They had built their entire identities on the perception of wealth. Without their credit cards and country club memberships, they were nothing but terrified bullies. Their desperation was palpable and entirely disgusting to witness. They honestly believed I would sacrifice my own self-respect to salvage their ruined social standing today. I realized they possessed absolutely no moral compass whatsoever. They were perfectly willing to sell my soul to the highest bidder to keep their luxury cars and massive mansions. Thomas paced like a caged animal. He said his employees would lose their jobs, and it would be entirely my fault. I reminded him calmly that a real chief executive officer would never leverage company operating capital to pay for his daughter's fraudulent lifestyle. That comment made him stop in his tracks, demanding respect. I told him respect was earned, not demanded. Catherine tried a different tactic, suddenly softening her voice to sound like a caring mother. She told me family always protects family, and if I did this one favor, everything could go back to normal. We could pretend the disaster at the wedding never happened. She promised she would even let me come to the country club for Thanksgiving. It was a manipulative, calculated pivot, hoping to buy my compliance with a fake promise of maternal affection. I looked at the woman who watched me be humiliated in front of 400 people 12 hours ago. I told her my definition of normal did not include covering up federal crimes. Felicity could not handle my calm demeanor. She jumped up from the sofa and demanded to know why I was acting so superior. She shouted that I was nothing, reiterating every single cruel thing Cameron had ever said to me. She said Cameron was a visionary genius building the future of software, and I was lucky he even tolerated my presence. She screamed that Cameron moved on to smarter and more beautiful women while I was stuck drinking cheap coffee in a tiny kitchen. She said I owed it to the family to use his lingering pity to save them. I let her finish her tantrum, watching her chest heave as she gasped for breath. Her designer trench coat slipped, revealing the wrinkled wedding dress underneath. I placed my empty coffee mug in the sink, turning to face them all. I told them their golden son-in-law Spencer was exactly where he belonged. I told them Thomas' business was failing because of his own profound incompetence. I stood perfectly still, never raising my voice or flinching at the cruel words about my infertility. I simply looked at my mother and told her no. I would not be calling Cameron. I would not be bailing Spencer out of jail, and I would not be saving my father failing business. Catherine's face contorted into a mask of pure vicious rage. She slammed her hand against the wall, telling me I was making the biggest mistake of my miserable life. She played the one card she thought gave her absolute power over my future. She brought up my grandmother trust fund. For years, Catherine held that massive multi-million-dollar generational trust over my head, like a guillotine threatening to have me permanently removed from the beneficiary list any time I stepped out of line. She used it to control and humiliate me. She promised right then that if I did not beg Cameron for money, she would call the family lawyers and have me officially disinherited before lunch. She screamed I would die broke and completely alone. I did not argue or beg her to reconsider. I simply took another sip of my coffee and let a cold, knowing smile spread across my face. That smile infuriated her more than any screaming match ever could. She could not comprehend why her ultimate threat was suddenly failing to terrify me. She had no idea I already knew exactly what was inside that trust fund. The tension in the room was completely suffocating. Before Catherine could launch into another screaming fit, there was a sharp, loud knock at my front door. The three of them froze, looking toward the entryway in shock. The door swung open, and Cameron strolled right into my apartment. My arrogant ex-husband was wearing a tailored designer suit, holding a thick legal binder under his arm. He stopped in the middle of my living room, surveying the absolute wreckage of my family. He looked directly at me, and a wide, smug grin spread across his face. "Your parents called me Savannah," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I am here to save the day." I stared right back at him, feeling no fear. This was exactly what I had been waiting for today. Cameron stood in the center of my living room as if he owned the entire building. His expensive designer cologne immediately filled the space, mixing with the bitter scent of my mother. Absolute panic. He shot a highly practiced, dazzling smile at Catherine and Thomas. My parents practically melted in his immediate presence. My father, who had just been screaming at me seconds ago, let out a massive sigh of relief. He actually reached out and shook Cameron's hand vigorously, thanking him for coming so quickly to help them. Catherine smoothed her wrinkled silk dress and offered him a seat, completely forgetting she was an uninvited intruder in my home. I remained standing by the kitchen island, holding my empty coffee mug. I watched the pathetic display of wealthy groveling with absolute pure fascination. Cameron had completely destroyed our marriage. He had humiliated me privately and publicly. Yet my parents still looked at him like he was a conquering hero sent by heaven itself to rescue them from the disaster of their own making. They were willing to sacrifice my dignity to save their own social status, without a single thought. The bright morning light poured through the large floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the absolute wreckage of my family. Cameron unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket and placed his thick black leather binder directly onto my clean quartz countertop. He spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of a man who believed he held all the winning cards in a high-stakes poker game. He announced that Thomas had called him crying from the car ride over, begging for a massive financial rescue. He stated he was fully aware that Spencer was currently sitting in a federal holding cell with his bail set at $2 million. He also knew that my father's supply chain company was completely paralyzed by the sudden federal asset freeze resulting from the wedding debacle. He chuckled, a dark, cruel sound that made my skin crawl. He looked at Felicity, who was still shivering in her oversized trench coat over her ruined bridal gown. He told her not to worry, because he had the liquid capital to solve every single one of their embarrassing problems today. He bragged loudly about his software startup valuation crossing the billion-dollar mark last quarter. My family hung on his every single word, treating his wealth like a religious experience. They nodded eagerly, desperate for his approval and his cash. They were completely blinded by his fake confidence. "But there is always a cost," Savannah Cameron said, leaning casually against my counter. "I do not run a charity. I run an empire." He tapped his fingers against the thick legal binder. He stated he would gladly wire the $2 million to secure Spencer immediate release from federal lockup today. He would also inject enough clean capital into Thomas Company to make payroll and hold off the federal auditors for a few months. Catherine clasped her hands together, praising his generosity loudly. Thomas loudly declared that Cameron was the son he always wished he had, totally disregarding my presence in my own apartment. Cameron held up a hand, silencing them immediately. He looked at me with cold, predatory eyes. He told them he would execute the wire transfers the exact moment I signed the documents inside his binder. I asked him what he wanted. He flipped the binder open, revealing a dense legal contract covered in bright yellow "Sign Here" tabs. He called it a retroactive post-nuptial agreement. He demanded I formally and legally sign away any future claims to his software company entirely. He wanted me to permanently sever my ties to his business before the company went public next month. He smirked, believing he had outsmarted me completely. He thought I was desperate. I stared at the pristine white pages. The sheer audacity of his demand was staggering. 5 years ago, I worked 3 exhausting minimum wage jobs just to keep the electricity on in our tiny studio apartment. While Cameron slept until noon and played video games, I stayed awake until 3 in the morning writing lines of complex code. I was the one who built the entire foundational architecture for his supposedly genius software platform. I engineered the proprietary algorithm that made his startup attractive to venture capitalists. When the first massive investment check cleared, Cameron filed for divorce. He told the judge I was unstable and lacked ambition. My family fully supported him during the bitter legal proceedings. Catherine had testified in court that Cameron was the real earner while I was just a barren housewife throwing a tantrum. They ridiculed me for claiming I wrote the foundational code. They sided entirely with his bank account. Now he wanted me to permanently sever my legal ties to the billion-dollar company I secretly built. He thought I was stupid enough to surrender my intellectual property just to save my abusive family from financial ruin. He wanted to steal my legacy twice and leave me with nothing. They all stood there waiting for my complete surrender. The silence in my apartment felt thick and suffocating as the reality of their demands washed over me. My parents had barged into my home completely uninvited, demanding that I fix their catastrophic mistakes. They never once apologized for the horrific things they projected on that massive screen at the wedding reception last night. They never once showed any remorse for mocking my painful struggles with infertility or my difficult divorce. Instead, they brought the exact man who had caused so much of my trauma directly into my private sanctuary. They were weaponizing my painful history to protect their fake wealthy lifestyle. They expected me to bow down and accept my role as the family scapegoat. They honestly believed that because I lived in a modest downtown apartment, I was entirely powerless. They assumed I had spent the last 5 years crying over Cameron leaving me, instead of quietly and methodically building an absolute global empire of my own. They did not understand that I was Vanguard Acquisitions. They did not know that I possessed more wealth and influence than Cameron and Thomas combined. I let them stand there soaking in their arrogant delusions for a few more seconds. I let them believe they had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner. I enjoyed watching their desperate, greedy expressions as they stared at that ridiculous legal binder. Felicity stomped forward, her wet wedding dress dragging across the floorboards. She grabbed a heavy brass pen from my counter and aggressively shoved it toward my chest. "Sign it," she hissed, her face twisted in absolute desperation. She told me I was ruining her life by being stubborn. "You are lucky a man like Cameron is even willing to be in the same room as you." She sneered, looking me up and down with intense disgust. She reminded me again that I could not even give him a child, and that this was my only chance to make up for being a completely useless wife. My parents nodded in agreement, stepping closer to box me in. They demanded I take the pen and sign the papers immediately so they could return to their perfect elite lives. Catherine stepped right into my personal space, her voice dropping to a vicious, threatening whisper. She told me if I refused to help them, she would call the family lawyers right now. She promised to permanently cut me out of my grandmother's multi-million-dollar generational trust fund. She said I would die broke, alone, and entirely forgotten by everyone in Chicago. She smirked, believing she had won. I looked at the brass pen in Felicity's shaking hand. I looked at Cameron, arrogant, expectant face waiting for me to surrender. I took the heavy pen from my sister. I held it firmly between my hands and applied sharp, sudden pressure. The thick brass snapped cleanly in half with a loud metallic crack. Black ink splattered across the pristine pages of Cameron legal binder, ruining the documents instantly. Felicity screamed, jumping back to avoid the dark ink stains on her coat. Cameron lunged forward, cursing loudly about his ruined contracts. I ignored them completely. I turned around and opened my sleek silver laptop, resting on the kitchen island. I pressed 3 keys, bringing the high-resolution screen to life. I turned the laptop around, facing the glowing display, directly toward Cameron. The screen showed a crisp, high-definition live security feed from the main lobby of his corporate headquarters in Silicon Valley. Dozens of federal marshals wearing heavy tactical gear were swarming his building, carrying out massive boxes of servers and hard drives. Cameron's face went completely pale as he watched his empire being dismantled live on my screen. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the counter. "Did you really think a shell company out of the Cayman Islands randomly funded your Series B?" I whispered. Cameron stumbled backward, as if physically struck by an invisible force. His expensive leather shoes squeaked awkwardly against the hardwood floor. He stared at the screen on my laptop, where federal agents were actively dismantling his fraudulent legacy. He blinked rapidly, processing the absolute catastrophe unfolding in real time. He pointed a trembling finger at the display, and then at me, stammering about anonymous venture capitalists and secure offshore accounts. He demanded to know how I could possibly have access to his supposedly untouchable Cayman Islands financial infrastructure. I kept my tone completely flat and clinical, letting the brutal facts crush his arrogant delusions. I informed Cameron that the anonymous angel investors who bailed him out during his Series B funding round were completely fictitious. The massive infusion of capital that saved his struggling software company did not come from an independent overseas hedge fund. It came directly from Vanguard Acquisitions. I told him I was the sole architect behind the shell company that purchased his debt and leveraged his equity. Through a series of highly structured corporate maneuvers, my firm quietly acquired 80% of his voting shares. I owned his company. I controlled his board of directors. As the majority shareholder, I possessed the absolute legal authority to tear down the entire corporate structure he thought he controlled. I watched his chest heave with panic as the reality of his situation set in. He tried to threaten me, shouting that he would call his lawyers and tie me up in litigation for the next decade. He claimed his foundational code was an impenetrable asset. I simply tapped a single key on my laptop, pulling up a highly encrypted digital dossier. I turned the screen toward him again. I showed him the exact offshore accounts where he had been illegally hiding the intellectual property he stole from me 5 years ago. He thought he was a genius for hiding the stolen assets, but he used the exact same basic encryption protocols I taught him when we were married. The federal marshals you see on that screen are currently executing a comprehensive search and seizure warrant, I stated clearly. They are securing every single server, hard drive, and physical ledger in your building. My legal team filed the documentation early this morning. Furthermore, I have officially invoked the moral turpitude clause clearly outlined in your founder agreement. Your illegal transfer of stolen intellectual property constitutes a massive breach of fiduciary duty and a direct violation of federal trade laws. You are effectively terminated as the chief executive officer immediately. His confident swagger had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, desperate shell of a man. My parents and Felicity stood frozen near the kitchen island, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the corporate execution they were witnessing. They had spent the last 5 years worshiping Cameron, holding him up as the ultimate standard of success, and punishing me for losing him. They had eagerly participated in my destruction, siding with the wealthy tech founder, while mocking my supposed lack of ambition. Now they were watching their golden son-in-law being professionally and financially dismembered right in front of their eyes. Thomas stared at the laptop screen, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. I accessed the secure internal trading platform and authorized the immediate aggressive liquidation of Cameron remaining founder shares. I initiated a massive fire sale, dumping his equity onto the open market and shorting the stock simultaneously. Within seconds, the valuation of his shares began to plummet rapidly. I narrated the financial freefall aloud, ensuring every single person in the room understood exactly what was happening. $50 a share, $30, $10, $3, $1, 0. His net worth was entirely wiped out. His company was gone. His legacy was destroyed. Cameron's legs gave out completely. He dropped heavily to his knees on my living room floor, the fabric of his tailored suit pants catching on the rug. The thick legal binder he had brought to threaten me lay discarded and forgotten near his feet. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. "Savannah, please," he begged, his voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "You cannot do this to me. I built this company. I gave it everything. Please stop the liquidation. I will give you whatever you want. I will sign the company over to you peacefully." I stepped around the kitchen island and walked over to where he was kneeling. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical satisfaction. I leaned in close, making sure my family could hear every single word. I reminded him of the day we finalized our divorce. "You called me a worthless, barren dropout," I whispered, my voice razor sharp. "You told everyone I was completely useless because I could not give you a child. You stole the code I wrote while working 3 jobs to feed you. You claimed you were a visionary genius while calling me a pathetic anchor dragging you down. A man like you does not get to beg for mercy when the bill finally comes due." Cameron buried his face in his hands, sobbing loudly. The sound was pathetic and entirely devoid of dignity. Thomas, who had been watching this entire execution in stunned silence, suddenly snapped out of his trance. The gears in his head shifted with dizzying speed. He looked at Cameron crying on the floor and immediately discarded him like a broken toy. Thomas realized that the man he had worshipped for 5 years was now completely worthless. The wealth and power he craved did not belong to Cameron. It belonged to me. Thomas stepped over Cameron's sobbing form and marched toward me, his posture completely transformed. He puffed out his chest and plastered on a bright, beaming smile. He acted as if the vicious screaming match from 10 minutes ago had never even occurred. He reached out to clap me on the shoulder, but I took a step back, avoiding his touch. "Savannah, my girl," he said, his voice booming with manufactured pride. "I knew you had it in you. I always knew you were destined for greatness. Look at what you have accomplished. You completely outsmarted him." That is the Vance family business instinct right there. The sheer hypocrisy was absolutely breathtaking. I stared at him, refusing to indulge his sudden bout of parental affection. Thomas did not let my cold reaction stop his desperate pivot. He rubbed his hands together, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. "Now that we have taken care of this dead weight," he said, gesturing dismissively toward Cameron, "we need to focus on family. My supply chain company is in serious trouble, Savannah. The federal freeze from last night is going to ruin everything I built. But you have Vanguard acquisitions. You can easily wire the funds to unfreeze my accounts and save our legacy. We are blood, Savannah. You can use your billions to protect your father." Catherine immediately jumped on the bandwagon, sensing a way out of their massive financial disaster. She smoothed her hair and offered me a sickeningly sweet smile. She completely forgot her previous threats to disinherit me. "Oh, darling, your father is right," she cooed, stepping closer. "We are so incredibly proud of you. You are our brilliant daughter. You can save the company, and we can put all this ugly business behind us. You do not need to worry about the trust fund anymore. We can merge our assets and dominate the Chicago social scene together. Just write the check and we can be a real family again." I crossed my arms and looked directly at Thomas. I told him I would not be writing a check today or any other day. I told him his failing supply chain company was not a legacy. It was a bloated, mismanaged disaster, and I would not waste a single cent of Vanguard capital bailing out a sinking ship. Catherine's fake smile vanished instantly. Her eyes narrowed, and the vicious, demanding matriarch returned in full force. She pointed her finger at me, her face flushing with renewed rage. "How dare you speak to your father that way?" she shrieked. "After everything we have done for you. If you do not wire that money right now, I will have you cut out of your grandmother trust fund immediately. I will call the lawyers and ensure you never see a single dime of that generational wealth." I simply smiled at her, looking entirely unbothered. I told her she was more than welcome to make that phone call. I actually encouraged her to pull her phone out right now and check the status of her precious trust fund. Catherine glared at me, snatching her phone from her designer purse. She intended to call the lawyer and loudly disinherit me in front of everyone. But before she could even unlock the screen, the device emitted a sharp, violent chime. It was an urgent priority alert from her private banking institution. Catherine swiped the notification, opening the secure banking portal. She stared at the screen, scanning the digital statement. The multi-million-dollar generational trust fund she had used as a weapon to control me for her entire life was displayed in bold text. She blinked rapidly, tapping the screen with a trembling finger, refusing to accept the reality of the numbers in front of her. The massive account balance, which had guaranteed her absolute authority and elite social dominance for decades, now read exactly zero. Her jaw dropped open in silent horror. She stood completely paralyzed as her entire world crashed down around her. The financial weapon she wielded against me was permanently gone. She had absolutely nothing left to ever use against me anymore. Catherine stared at her phone screen as if the glowing pixels had physically burned her eyes. The silence in my apartment stretched until it felt like a taut wire ready to snap. Suddenly, she let out a piercing shriek that rattled the delicate glass light fixtures hanging above my kitchen island. She hurled her designer handbag onto the floor and lunged toward the counter. "You hacked it!" she screamed, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. "You hacked the family trust account, Savannah. You stole my money because you are a jealous, vindictive little thief." Thomas rushed to his wife, grabbing her shoulders to hold her back as she thrashed against him. He demanded to know what she was talking about, but Catherine could only point a trembling, manicured finger at her phone screen, repeating the word zero over and over again. Felicity backed away from her mother, her eyes darting nervously between the shattered brass pen on the counter and the completely defeated form of Cameron still weeping silently on the hardwood floor. I did not flinch at Catherine screaming. I simply reached into the deep drawer of my kitchen island and pulled out a thick manila folder. I opened it and extracted a heavy stack of printed bank statements, setting them squarely on the white quartz countertop. I slid the papers across the smooth surface, stopping right in front of Thomas. I told Catherine I had absolutely no need to hack her precious trust fund because her golden child had already done the heavy lifting. I tapped the top page of the statement. "Look at the transaction history, Thomas," but instructed, my voice perfectly calm and completely detached. "Look at where your generational wealth actually went." Thomas released his wife and grabbed the papers, his eyes scanning the highlighted columns. Catherine leaned over his arm, her breathing ragged and shallow. The realization hit them both with the force of a runaway freight train crashing through their delicate glass house of lies. For the last 3 years, my perfect sister had been systematically draining the Vance family trust fund dry. The bank statements detailed a relentless daily barrage of massive wire transfers and exorbitant credit card payments. I watched Thomas trace his finger down a list of expenditures that completely destroyed the illusion of Felicity perfect life. She had not just stolen my identity to commit federal wire fraud. She had forged Catherine's signature to grant herself unrestricted administrative access to the primary trust account. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been funneled directly into maintaining her flawless, highly curated social media aesthetic. Every luxury vacation, every designer handbag, every five-star dining experience she posted online was paid for with stolen family money. She had purchased an entire alternate reality using funds she never actually earned. But the superficial luxury spending was just the very tip of the iceberg. I pointed to a specific series of recurring six-figure wire transfers routed to obscure offshore holding companies and completely anonymous shell corporations. Those particular wires did not pay for designer shoes, I explained, watching Felicity physically shrink into her oversized trench coat. Those transfers paid off Spencer massive underground gambling debts. Thomas' head snapped up, his eyes wide with horrified comprehension. I laid out the brutal facts without a single ounce of pity. Spencer was not a brilliant private equity investor. He was a degenerate gambler who owed millions of dollars to incredibly dangerous people. Felicity had aggressively drained the family fortune to keep the brutal loan sharks from breaking her husband's legs. She sacrificed the entire Vance family legacy to protect a degenerate criminal and maintain her fake internet popularity. The irony was absolutely delicious. For decades, Catherine and Thomas had relentlessly shamed me. They called me a financial drain, a lazy dropout, and a worthless burden who would never contribute anything of value to their prestigious lineage. They continuously praised Felicity as the ultimate standard of success while treating me like an incurable disease. Now the irrefutable proof of their profound blindness was sitting in dark ink right in front of them. Their favorite daughter, the brilliant golden child they worshipped, had completely bankrupted them. Thomas dropped the bank statements as if they were suddenly covered in burning acid. He slowly turned his head to look at Felicity. His face was completely devoid of color. "You stole from us," he whispered, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of deep betrayal and absolute rage. "You stole your mother money to pay for Spencer's pathetic gambling problem." Felicity shook her head violently, tears streaming down her pale face. She took a step backward, bumping into the living room sofa. "Daddy, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. I had to do it. Spencer said he was going to win it all back. He promised me he had a sure thing. If I did not pay them, they were going to hurt him severely. I was going to put the money back before you ever noticed. Catherine let out a sound that was half sob and half feral scream. "Put it back," she shrieked, launching herself toward Felicity. "With what money, you stupid, selfish girl? You completely ruined us." Catherine grabbed Felicity by the shoulders, shaking her violently. The oversized trench coat slipped off my sister's shoulders, entirely revealing the mud-stained, wrinkled bridal gown underneath. Catherine slapped Felicity across the face with a loud, sharp, physical crack. The harsh sound echoed through the entire apartment, snapping the last remaining threads of their fake high society facade. Felicity collapsed onto the plush sofa, holding her bright red cheek and sobbing hysterically. She loudly blamed Spencer for manipulating her. She blamed the terrible economy for ruining their investments. She even tried to blame me, claiming that if I had just been a better sister and shared my secret wealth earlier, she would not have been forced to steal from our parents. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was staggering to witness. Thomas ran his shaking hands over his sweaty face, pacing erratically across my living room floor. He blindly stepped entirely over Cameron, who was still curled up in a miserable ball near the glass coffee table, clutching his knees and rocking back and forth in total silence. My quiet apartment had rapidly transformed into a chaotic psychiatric ward for the recently ruined elite. Thomas abruptly stopped pacing and looked wildly around the bright room. His entire comfortable reality had been violently obliterated in the span of 20 short minutes. His golden son-in-law was a detained federal criminal. His favorite daughter was a desperate thief who had quietly bankrupted the family. His other son-in-law was a ruined corporate fraud, facing total financial liquidation and massive public disgrace. The only person standing in the room possessing any real power or substantial capital was the exact daughter he had spent his entire life emotionally destroying and pushing away. He turned back to face me, his eyes wide and completely frantic with fear. "Savannah," he pleaded, holding both his hands out toward me in a grand gesture of pure, unadulterated desperation. "Savannah, you absolutely have to fix this disaster. You must use Vanguard Acquisitions to cover these devastating financial losses immediately. We can officially report the trust fund theft as a minor banking misunderstanding. We can quickly bail Spencer out of federal custody and quietly pay off the dangerous bookies. We can easily hide the corporate fraud. You clearly have billions of dollars in liquid assets. You can make all of this terrible ugliness go away right now." He was practically hyperventilating, begging me to become a willing accessory to his daughter, multiple severe crimes just to save his precious social reputation. I looked directly at the pathetic man who had always mercilessly demanded absolute perfection from me and offered him a slow, chilling smile. I told him he was completely out of his mind. I told him I would gladly rather burn every single dollar I possessed than spend even a fraction of a penny protecting the exact people who had treated me like disposable garbage for my entire existence. I coldly reminded him that worthless failures simply do not belong in my successful family, quoting his exact vicious words back to him from years ago. Thomas opened his mouth to scream at me to demand my total unquestioning obedience through sheer parental authority, but his angry words were instantly cut off. A harsh, mechanical vibration echoed loudly through the quiet room. Thomas' left wrist suddenly illuminated brightly. His heavy platinum smartwatch buzzed violently against his damp skin. He glanced down, intending to swipe the distraction away, but froze. He stared directly at the tiny glowing screen, reading the terrible notification. His flagship supply chain company board of directors had just called an emergency meeting. The urgent email clearly displayed on his wrist demanded his immediate and unconditional resignation. Thomas stared at his smartwatch screen in absolute panic. The glowing text demanding his immediate resignation from the board of directors blinked relentlessly. He let out a breathless, strangled gasp, completely abandoning the financial wreckage of his ruined trust fund. He grabbed Catherine by her arm, pulling her aggressively toward the front door. He barked at Felicity to stand up and stop crying. He completely ignored the horrific reality he was leaving behind in my apartment, choosing to entirely fixate on his failing supply chain empire. He sprinted, dragging his ruined family in a frantic scramble to save his legacy. I did not chase them down the hallway. I simply closed my silver laptop, adjusted my blazer, and took the private service elevator down to the parking garage. I arrived at his towering downtown corporate headquarters a full 10 minutes before his panicked convoy pulled into the circular loading zone. Thomas slammed his luxury sedan into a restricted parking space directly in front of the sweeping glass entrance. He scrambled out of the driver's seat, sprinting wildly toward the building, while Catherine and Felicity struggled to keep up behind him. His face was flushed crimson, coated in heavy, nervous sweat. He marched straight toward the VIP security turnstiles, aggressively slapping his chief executive keycard against the optical scanner. Instead of the familiar welcoming green light, the scanner flashed a harsh, vibrating red. Access denied. Thomas grunted in frustration, assuming it was a simple technological glitch. He slapped the heavy plastic card against the reader again, striking it much harder this time. Red. He tried a third time, practically slamming his closed fist into the delicate machine. Red. His access was permanently revoked. A sharp, metallic beep echoed loudly through the cavernous marble lobby, drawing the attention of passing corporate employees. The head of building security stepped directly into his path. His name was Marcus. For the last 10 years, Thomas had treated Marcus like absolute garbage. My father routinely screamed at him for minor parking infractions, mocked his uniform, and once threatened to fire him right before Christmas over a delayed package. Thomas never bothered to learn his last name. Now Marcus stood incredibly tall, blocking the executive turnstiles, wearing a completely unbothered, stony expression. Thomas' face twisted into a mask of supreme, aristocratic rage, pointing a trembling finger at Marcus' chest. He demanded a manual system override immediately today. He screamed that he was the chief executive officer, the sole founder, and the absolute king of this building. He shouted that Marcus would be standing in the unemployment line before lunch if the glass gates were not opened right that exact second. Catherine rushed up behind her husband, adding her shrill, demanding voice to the chaotic echo in the lobby, demanding respect. Marcus did not flinch or step aside. He simply crossed his muscular arms over his chest and looked down at my father with deep, palpable satisfaction. He stated the building was under entirely new management protocols now. He informed Thomas that his executive credentials had been permanently deactivated by the majority shareholder just 15 minutes ago. Marcus calmly explained that he was strictly ordered to deny Thomas Vance any entry beyond the public waiting area, unless accompanied by a corporate escort. Thomas looked as though he might physically combust on the spot. He began screaming obscenities, completely losing whatever tiny shred of professional decorum he had left. He demanded to know exactly who dared to lock him out of his own empire. Before Marcus could reply, the polished steel doors of the private elevator chimed beautifully loud. The heavy doors slid open smoothly. I stepped out into the grand marble lobby, my heels clicking sharply against the pristine floor. The sharp sound cut through my father, frantic screaming, drawing all eyes directly to me. I walked slowly past the massive corporate logo bolted to the wall, holding a sleek black leather folder tucked securely under my right arm. Thomas froze completely, his jaw dropping open in utter disbelief. Catherine grabbed his arm, her terrified eyes darting between me and the locked security gates. Felicity, still wearing her ruined trench coat, simply stared in numb, horrified silence today. Thomas finally found his voice, demanding to know what I was doing, stepping out of his private elevator. He shouted that I needed to stop playing childish games and order the security guard to let him up to the boardroom immediately. He actually believed I was just a visitor who had somehow sneaked into the building. I stopped a few feet away from the security turnstiles, looking directly through the thick protective glass at my ruined family. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute chilling clarity, ensuring the lobby acoustics carried every single word to their ears. I informed Thomas that he no longer had a boardroom. I told him his failing supply chain company had been bleeding cash for 3 consecutive quarters and was drowning in toxic, unmanageable debt. I revealed that Vanguard Acquisitions, my firm, had systematically purchased every single outstanding corporate bond, completely buying out the board, massive, suffocating debt late yesterday evening. By leveraging that massive financial anchor, Vanguard effectively executed a hostile, absolute corporate takeover. I was no longer his disappointed daughter. I was the new majority shareholder of his entire corporate legacy. I owned the building, the brand, and his future. Thomas stumbled backward, shaking his head in frantic, desperate denial. He shouted that I was lying. He screamed that he built this company from nothing, with his own bare hands, sweat, and tireless determination. He claimed he was a self-made titan of industry, and I had no right to steal his life work. I looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. I completely shattered his self-made mythological delusion right there in the lobby. I reminded him of the truth he had conveniently buried a decade ago. I told him he did not build this company from absolutely nothing. He built it using the exact college fund my grandfather had meticulously saved for me. When his first massive logistics contract collapsed 10 years ago, he secretly forged my signature and drained my entire educational trust to keep his business from declaring absolute bankruptcy. He literally stole my future to save his own inflated ego. Because he stole that money, I could not pay my university tuition. I was forced to drop out of school my junior year. Instead of apologizing or admitting his financial failure to our elite social circle, Thomas and Catherine ruthlessly threw me under the bus. They told all their country club friends, their business partners, and their wealthy neighbors that I was simply too stupid to handle the rigorous academic pressure. They maliciously labeled me a lazy, incompetent dropout to completely cover up his massive financial crime. They willingly sacrificed my entire reputation to protect his fragile corporate pride. Thomas' face drained of all color as his darkest, most guarded secret was dragged brutally into the bright lobby light. Catherine gasped loudly, covering her mouth, realizing her husband had just been utterly exposed in front of the entire security staff and passing corporate office workers. Felicity looked away suddenly, finding the marble floor absolutely fascinating. Thomas tried to fall back on the only defensive tactic he knew. He tried to assert his absolute parental dominance. He puffed out his chest, stepping right up to the security glass, trying to look physically intimidating. He pointed his finger directly at my face. He ordered me as my father to immediately transfer the voting shares back to his name. He screamed that I owed him everything for putting a roof over my head when I was a child. He demanded I reinstate him as chief executive officer immediately. He threatened to ensure I was completely destroyed in the business world if I refused. I did not blink or step back. I slowly opened the sleek black leather folder I was holding. I pulled out a thick, legally binding document printed on heavy stock paper. I slid it deliberately through the narrow security slot in the glass partition. The papers landed right at his expensive leather shoes. I told him that was a full legally verified confession detailing his extensive corporate embezzlement, his illegal offshore accounting practices, and the exact unredacted paper trail of my stolen college fund today. I gave him a non-negotiable ultimatum. If he signed the confession immediately stepping down with a full admission of his financial crimes, I would allow him to keep his modest corporate pension. If he refused, I would hand the unredacted file directly over to federal authorities before lunch. Thomas stared at the papers on the floor, shaking violently. He let out a loud, arrogant, barking laugh, refusing flatly. He confidently declared the board of directors were his closest personal friends and would never vote against him. I smiled brightly and formally introduced the new chairman of the board today. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom. Declan, my loyal chief operating officer, stood framed in the doorway, holding a silver tablet. He wore a charcoal suit and an unbothered expression. I recruited Declan 3 years ago after Thomas ruthlessly scapegoated him for a massive quarterly loss. That was entirely my father's fault. Now Declan was acting chairman of the board. Thomas stared at the man he publicly humiliated and illegally terminated. The color drained from his face. Thomas hesitated, but his arrogance forced him to walk through the doors. Catherine and Felicity trailed behind him, looking like terrified hostages. The mahogany conference table was fully occupied, but the faces looking at Thomas were completely unfamiliar. I walked to the head of the table and sat. I watched my father frantically scan the room, searching for a friendly face. He found none. I reconstructed this board over the past 6 months, I announced, my voice echoing cleanly across the quiet room. I bought out your golfing buddies, Thomas. I offered them massive golden parachutes, and they happily sold you out without a second thought. I replaced them with the exact people you spent the last 2 decades destroying. I gestured around the long table, highlighting the executives sitting before us. Thomas looked directly at Sarah, the logistics director he fired because she requested maternity leave. He saw Marcus, the supply chain analyst he forced into early retirement, to avoid paying his pension. He locked eyes with Elena, the talented financial officer he passed over for promotion simply because she was a woman. These were the marginalized, professionals whose careers Thomas actively tried to ruin. I recruited every single one of them, utilizing their intimate knowledge of his company to orchestrate my hostile takeover. They were loyal entirely to me. Thomas slammed his fist down on the mahogany table, refusing to accept defeat. He puffed out his chest, looking directly at Sarah and Marcus. He proclaimed he was the visionary founder of this company, and they owed him their entire livelihoods. He played the family loyalty card, screaming a daughter should never usurp her own father. He ordered them to invalidate my shares and reinstate him as the chief executive officer immediately. He believed his booming voice could bully them into submission. Nobody flinched. Nobody looked away. The seasoned executives simply stared at him with cold, calculating detachment. They had spent years terrified of his toxic management style, but that fear was completely gone today. Declan tapped the screen of his silver tablet, bringing the digital display at the end of the room to life. He did not raise his voice or match my father's frantic energy. He simply presented the devastating, unvarnished truth. "We are not here to discuss your parental grievances." Thomas Declan stated, his tone razor sharp. "We are here to officially review the results of the forensic financial audit Vanguard Acquisitions completed this morning." Declan swiped his finger across the tablet. The giant screen illuminated with dozens of highlighted bank statements, corporate ledgers, and classified tax documents. Thomas staggered backward as the intricate web of his massive financial crimes was projected for everyone to see in high-definition colors. Catherine gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Felicity let out a soft whimper. Declan methodically walked the board through the staggering evidence. He proved that Thomas had been illegally leveraging critical company assets to fund Felicity's lavish, fabricated lifestyle. The audit clearly demonstrated that the corporate operating capital was being directly funneled into fake vendor accounts. Those accounts were then used to purchase Felicity expensive luxury vehicles, including the custom SUV she proudly posted on her social media accounts last week. Declan highlighted a massive wire transfer originally designated for warehouse safety upgrades. The screen showed that exact sum being illegally diverted to pay for my sister's luxurious vacation in the Maldives. Every single designer gown, every single first-class flight, every piece of expensive diamond jewelry. Felicity paraded around Chicago was paid for with stolen corporate funds. Thomas actively embezzled millions of dollars from his own company, completely starving his hardworking employees of their promised bonuses just to maintain the absolute illusion that his golden child was a spectacular success. He starved his actual business to feed her bottomless vanity. "You treated this corporate entity like your own personal piggy bank." Declan continued, his voice echoing with righteous authority. "You engaged in massive structural fraud. You deliberately falsified quarterly earnings reports to completely hide your massive illegal withdrawals. You actively jeopardized the livelihoods of 400 dedicated employees to fund your daughter's fake internet popularity and her husband's underground gambling debts." Thomas tried to interrupt, stammering wildly about minor accounting errors and temporary liquidity issues. He desperately claimed he was planning to return every stolen cent before the end of the fiscal year. Elena, the financial officer he mercilessly marginalized, leaned forward, resting her elbows on the heavy table. She looked my father dead in the eye and coldly informed him that the federal auditors would completely disagree with his pathetic assessment. She told him his illegal actions met every single legal definition of severe corporate fraud. Catherine turned on her husband, her eyes wide with total panic. She grabbed his arm, shaking him violently. She screamed at him, demanding to know if he had actually ruined their social standing. She realized that her precious country club friends would soon know she was married to a broke, disgraced criminal. Thomas shoved her away, unraveling under the intense pressure of the boardroom ambush. He looked at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. He ordered me to stop the audit immediately. I leaned back in my comfortable leather chair, crossing my arms. I looked at the man who stole my college fund, ruined my education, and proudly mocked my valid pain for my entire adult life. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I simply nodded to Declan, signaling him to finish the corporate execution. Declan stood up, straightening his suit jacket. As the acting chairman of the board, I officially call for an immediate vote, he announced, his voice cutting through the chaotic shouting. Based on the irrefutable evidence of massive financial embezzlement, I motion to permanently strip Thomas Vance of his chief executive title. I motion to immediately invalidate all his remaining corporate protections, including his executive pension and golden parachute. I further motion to compel the immediate surrender of his voting shares to Vanguard Acquisitions to cover the massive financial damages he inflicted upon this entity. Thomas screamed that they could not do this to him. He shouted that he was the founding patriarch and he would destroy them all in federal court. He pounded his fists against the heavy mahogany table, throwing a temper tantrum that completely stripped away his final shred of dignity. Declan ignored his screaming completely. "All those in favor?" Declan asked, looking around the long table. Every single executive in the room raised their right hand simultaneously. The vote was absolutely unanimous. There was no hesitation, no remorse, and no pity for the toxic tyrant who had terrorized them for over a decade. Sarah, Marcus, Elena, and the rest of the board formally eradicated his entire corporate existence in one swift, unified motion. The motion carries, Declan stated, firmly tapping his tablet to record the devastating verdict. Thomas Vance, you are officially terminated, effective immediately. You no longer possess any legal authority within this building. You have 0 shares, 0 corporate protections, and 0 assets. You are currently trespassing on private property owned by Vanguard Acquisitions. The finality of the statement hit Thomas like a physical sledgehammer. His knees buckled slightly, and he gripped the back of a leather chair just to keep himself standing. He looked at me, his eyes wide and hollow. He realized that his empire, his wealth, his status, and his power were permanently gone. I had taken everything from him without raising my voice once. Catherine began to sob loudly, mourning the sudden loss of her elite lifestyle. She realized she would have to face her wealthy friends as a completely broke, disgraced pariah. She wailed about losing her suburban estate and her luxury cars. Felicity, who had been violently trembling in the corner, suddenly snapped. She could not handle the reality of her absolute destruction. Her stolen trust fund was completely gone. Her fake online aesthetic was fully exposed as a massive criminal fraud. Her husband was sitting in a federal holding cell. She lunged forward, her wedding dress ripping. "You think you won, Savannah?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "Spencer parents are old money elite. They will destroy you with defamation lawsuits and false arrest charges. They will bankrupt Vanguard completely. They will throw you in federal prison for locking up their perfect son." Right at that exact moment, the frosted glass boardroom doors flew violently open, hitting the walls with a massive crash. Spencer's furious, wealthy parents immediately aggressively stormed right into the room. The heavy frosted glass doors bounced violently off the soundproofed walls with a thunderous crash that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. 2 imposing figures marched aggressively into the boardroom, completely ignoring the stunned executives sitting around the mahogany table. Spencer's wealthy parents, Charles and Eleanor Harrington, moved with the terrifying synchronized entitlement of the absolute social elite. Charles wore a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. Eleanor clutched a rare crocodile skin handbag, her face pulled into a tight mask of venomous aristocratic fury. Felicity let out a loud, dramatic sob of pure relief. She scrambled away from her terrified parents and physically hid behind Eleanor's perfectly tailored frame. The cavalry had finally arrived to rescue the golden child from the consequences of her own devastating crimes. Charles did not even bother to introduce himself to the board of directors. He marched directly toward the head of the table, planting his hands firmly on the polished wood and glaring down at me with unadulterated hatred. He pointed a thick manicured finger directly at my face. "You are a dead woman walking Savannah," he snarled, his deep voice booming with absolute malicious intent. "You had my son arrested by federal agents like a common street thug. You dragged the Harrington family name through the mud and destroyed our impeccable public reputation. I have the most ruthless, aggressive lawyers in the country already filing emergency motions. We are going to sue your pathetic little firm into absolute oblivion for severe defamation, malicious prosecution, and false arrest. We will take every single penny you own and ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a concrete cell." Eleanor wrapped her arm protectively around a weeping Felicity, stroking my sister hair while glaring daggers at me. She called me a jealous, sociopathic monster who was simply obsessed with ruining their perfect son because I could never achieve true, elite status. Felicity nodded enthusiastically, wiping her dramatic tears and peering out from behind her wealthy mother-in-law. Felicity boldly declared that Spencer was an innocent victim of my corporate bullying. She proudly announced that the Harringtons would utterly crush me and restore her stolen wealth. Thomas and Catherine watched the chaotic scene unfold with sudden, desperate hope gleaming in their eyes. They foolishly believed Charles Harrington's incredible wealth and vast legal connections could somehow intimidate me into dropping the entire investigation and reversing the hostile takeover. They expected me to cower in fear and beg for mercy under the crushing weight of high society intimidation. I remained seated in my comfortable leather chair, completely unfazed by their theatrical performance. I looked calmly at Charles, taking in his arrogant posture and his furious red face. I told him he should be very careful about casually tossing around the phrase common street thug. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I reminded Charles and Eleanor that their pristine social reputation was nothing but a fragile illusion built on the broken backs of desperate people. The Harrington family did not build their massive wealth through brilliant financial investments or innovative tech startups. They built their sprawling empire by acting as ruthless, predatory slumlords. They owned thousands of decaying, mold-infested, low-income housing units across the state. They routinely evicted struggling single mothers shut off the heat in the dead of winter to force tenants out and aggressively gentrified neighborhoods without a single shred of human decency or basic morality. Charles' face twitched, his arrogant facade slipping for a brief microsecond before he quickly recovered. He demanded I shut my mouth immediately, threatening me with further legal retaliation for slander. I ignored his empty threats entirely. I looked directly into his cold, empty eyes and told him I knew all about his specific business practices firsthand. When Thomas and Catherine completely disowned me and kicked me out of my childhood home, they threw me onto the cold, unforgiving street with nothing but the clothes on my back. I was 18 years old, terrified and completely broke because Thomas had secretly drained my college fund. The very first apartment I could barely afford to rent was a decaying, freezing studio in a crumbling brick building located on the wrong side of the city. That exact building was owned and operated by Harrington Holdings. I described the black mold growing aggressively up the bathroom walls. I detailed the broken radiators that forced me to sleep in my winter coat for 3 consecutive months. I reminded Charles of the illegal late fees his property managers mercilessly piled onto my rent when I was struggling to buy groceries. I survived in his freezing, squalid property while he used my rent money to buy his precious son's sports cars and designer watches. I told him I knew exactly what kind of ruthless parasites he and his wife truly were. Charles sneered at me, claiming my sad little poverty story meant absolutely nothing to him or his expensive lawyers. He demanded I immediately release his son and surrender my company to compensate them for the emotional damage I had recklessly caused their family. I did not waste my breath arguing with his ridiculous demands. I simply stood up from my chair and reached into my sleek leather briefcase. I pulled out a small white adapter cable. I looked directly at Felicity, who was still hiding pathetically behind Eleanor. I asked my sister if she remembered the beautiful multimedia presentation she organized for her extravagant wedding reception. I reminded her how much she loved hooking up her devices to projectors to publicly humiliate people she viewed as socially inferior. Felicity's face drained of all color, her eyes widening in sudden abject terror as she realized exactly what I was doing. I walked over to the massive boardroom control console. I plugged the white adapter cable directly into my silver tablet and connected it to the main boardroom projector system. I tapped the screen once. The massive digital display screen at the far end of the long mahogany table flashed to life instantly. I did not project silly, embarrassing photos of a crying child. I projected a comprehensive, unredacted presentation detailing decades of severe international financial crimes. The first slide displayed high-resolution scans of multiple offshore banking accounts located in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. The accounts were cleverly hidden behind a complex maze of anonymous shell corporations, but the ultimate beneficiary name was clearly highlighted in bright yellow ink: Charles Harrington. The second slide revealed an intricate illegal tax evasion scheme, demonstrating exactly how Harrington Holdings systematically hid millions of dollars in rental income from the federal government over the past 15 years. The financial ledgers were absolutely damning and undeniably authentic. Charles stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. The arrogant bluster completely vanished from his demeanor, replaced by sheer, suffocating panic. Eleanor dropped her expensive crocodile handbag, the heavy accessory hitting the floor with a loud thud. She let go of Felicity, stepping away from my sister as if she had suddenly become highly contagious. The elite confidence they walked into the room with was entirely obliterated in a matter of seconds. I tapped my tablet screen again, bringing up the final, most devastating slide. It was not enough for them to simply evade taxes and exploit low-income tenants. They had actively participated in my former boss Cameron's massive corporate espionage scheme. The large screen displayed a series of undeniable wire transfers sent directly from a secure Harrington Holdings corporate account into Cameron Offshore Shell Company. Charles and Eleanor Harrington were the secret wealthy investors who had aggressively bankrolled Cameron when he illegally stole my proprietary software patent. They had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into Cameron's fraudulent enterprise, hoping to reap massive illicit profits when he sold my stolen technology to foreign competitors. They were completely legally complicit in severe corporate espionage, massive intellectual property theft, and international wire fraud. They had knowingly funded a criminal enterprise to destroy my career and enrich their already bloated bank accounts. Charles opened his mouth, attempting to form a coherent sentence, but only a strangled, raspy sound emerged from his throat. He looked around the boardroom, seeing the cold, unforgiving faces of my loyal executives staring back at him. He realized there was no escape from the digital evidence glowing brightly on the wall. I calmly disconnected my silver tablet from the projector console, sliding it smoothly back into my leather briefcase. I checked my sleek silver wristwatch, casually noting the precise time. I looked back at the terrified couple standing frozen near the frosted glass doors. I informed Charles and Eleanor that they did not need to bother calling their expensive white shoe lawyers to file defamation lawsuits against me. I told them their high-priced legal team was going to be entirely occupied with much more pressing federal matters. I smiled warmly and revealed that the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division had received this exact unredacted digital presentation precisely 60 minutes ago. I informed them that federal agents were likely tearing through their pristine corporate headquarters and their sprawling suburban mansion right at this very moment. Eleanor let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She grabbed her husband by the arm, her manicured fingernails digging desperately into the expensive fabric of his bespoke suit. "We need to leave Charles!" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, frantic wail. "We have to call the attorneys right now." They did not even look back at Felicity. They completely abandoned their weeping daughter-in-law, showing absolutely zero family loyalty when their own wealth and freedom were suddenly on the line. Charles and Eleanor Harrington practically shoved each other out of the way as they sprinted through the boardroom doors, fleeing down the corporate hallway in absolute blind panic. The heavy glass doors slowly swung shut behind them, sealing the room in a heavy, suffocating silence. Felicity stood alone in the center of the room, her final lifeline completely severed. Her powerful high society protectors had abandoned her to save themselves. Catherine watched the Harringtons flee in total horror. She realized her wealthy, influential allies were entirely gone. Her husband was a disgraced, ruined former executive. Her favorite daughter was an exposed criminal. Her entire elite social world had been systematically dismantled and burned to the ground. Catherine's legs suddenly gave out beneath her. She collapsed heavily onto her knees on the expensive carpet. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "Savannah, please," she cried dramatically, throwing her hands up in a pathetic gesture of complete surrender. She immediately shifted her entire personality, attempting a brand new tactic. She sobbed loudly, loudly declaring herself a clueless, innocent victim of her husband and daughter, terrible actions. She begged for my mercy, completely playing the role of a devastated, helpless mother who had been cruelly deceived by everyone around her. Catherine remained crumpled on the expensive carpet of the corporate boardroom. She looked absolutely pathetic. The flawlessly curated matriarch of the Vance family was now reduced to a weeping, trembling mess. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, staining her designer silk skirt. She reached out her hands toward me as if she were praying to a deity she had spent her entire life mocking. Her manicured fingers clawed desperately at the hem of my tailored trousers. "Savannah, please." Catherine whimpered, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. "You have to listen to me. I had absolutely no idea what Thomas and Felicity were doing behind my back. I am just a mother who trusted her family. I am a victim of their terrible greed. You cannot destroy your own blood, Savannah. You cannot ruin your own mother. We share the exact same DNA. You have to show mercy to the woman who gave you life." I stared down at her, watching the crocodile tears ruin her expensive mascara. The sheer audacity of her performance was genuinely impressive. She had seamlessly pivoted from vicious aristocratic entitlement to helpless victimhood in less than 3 minutes. She expected me to feel a sudden surge of filial loyalty, to forget the decades of psychological torment simply because she was now crying on the floor. I did not flinch. I did not offer her a hand up. I let her stay right where she belonged. I simply stared at her, waiting for the inevitable shift in her strategy. Catherine realized her pathetic tears were completely failing to penetrate my cold detachment. She sniffled loudly, wiping her cheeks with the back of her trembling hand. She frantically changed her strategy yet again. "Fine," she choked out, her voice dropping its helpless cadence and adopting a desperate bargaining tone. "Fine, Savannah. Take the company. Take Vanguard Acquisitions. Let Thomas rot in his own corporate mess, and let Felicity deal with the federal authorities. I do not care anymore. But you have to leave us the generational estate. You have to give me back the deed to the family mansion. We need a place to live. You cannot throw your own mother out onto the street. That house is my entire life. It is the core of my social identity. You have billions of dollars in liquid assets now. You do not need that old building. Just give me the deed and I will walk away quietly. I will never bother you again. Please, Savannah." I looked at the weeping woman on the floor and felt a sharp, bitter laugh rise in my chest. The utter hypocrisy was staggering. For my entire childhood, Catherine had used that massive, sprawling estate as a psychological weapon against me. Whenever I stepped out of line, whenever I failed to achieve absolute perfection or dared to express a single independent thought, she would instantly remind me of my precarious position. She used to stand at the top of the grand marble staircase looking down at me with pure disdain. She would coldly state that I was merely a temporary guest in a wealthy neighborhood where I fundamentally did not belong. She would tell me that my presence was a burden on her flawless aesthetic. If I ever tracked mud into the pristine foyer or accidentally left a textbook on the mahogany dining table, Catherine would immediately threaten to throw my belongings out the front door. She constantly reminded me that the luxurious roof over my head was a privilege that could be instantly revoked if I embarrassed her prestigious lineage. She conditioned me to live in constant paralyzing fear of eviction. She made sure I understood that the generational mansion was her absolute domain, and I was nothing but an unwanted intruder trespassing in her flawless kingdom. She would host lavish garden parties and force me to stay locked in my bedroom so her wealthy friends would not have to look at the family disappointment. She wielded that mansion like a heavy, blunt instrument, constantly battering my self-worth into absolute submission. Now, the exact woman who spent 18 years reminding me I did not belong was begging on her knees for the right to stay. I slowly walked around the edge of the heavy conference table, putting deliberate physical distance between us. I told Catherine that her sudden attachment to the family estate was incredibly ironic considering she never actually owned it in the first place. I watched as the absolute confusion washed over her tear-stained face. Catherine froze. Her sobbing instantly stopped. She looked up at me, her face freezing into a mask of sudden sheer terror. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She knew exactly what I was about to say, and the realization paralyzed her vocal cords completely. The desperate pleading vanished from her eyes, replaced by the cold, suffocating dread of a criminal who realizes they have finally been caught. I reached down into my open leather briefcase, resting securely on the table. I ignored the sleek modern electronics and the digital tablets. Instead, I reached into a hidden zippered compartment and pulled out an old, heavily creased, yellowed document. The thick parchment paper crackled loudly in the quiet boardroom, carrying the undeniable weight of decades-old legal authority. I held the faded document up by its corners, ensuring Catherine had a perfectly clear view of the blue ink signature stamped at the very bottom. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to look at the irrefutable evidence of her darkest secret. I informed Catherine that my late grandfather was an incredibly perceptive man. He built the original Vance fortune through grueling physical labor and relentless discipline. He watched with quiet, mounting disgust as Thomas and Catherine transformed his hard-earned legacy into a superficial circus of pure aristocratic vanity. He knew exactly what kind of ruthless, entitled monsters they were becoming. He also recognized the toxic, agonizing environment I was trapped in. He saw how Catherine actively marginalized me to elevate Felicity. My grandfather was the only person in that sprawling, miserable mansion who actually loved me unconditionally. He was the only one who saw my true potential. Before he passed away, my grandfather made a very specific, highly confidential legal arrangement. He bypassed the standard family trust entirely. He knew that if he left the primary estate to Thomas, Catherine would immediately squander its value to fund her country club lifestyle. He also knew she would use the house as ultimate leverage to completely control and destroy my future. So he quietly met with his private estate attorneys and fundamentally altered the overarching inheritance structure. He created a bulletproof legal firewall to protect me from her boundless greed. I tapped the yellowed parchment paper. I told Catherine that this specific document was the original unmodified deed to the Vance generational estate. When I was just a teenager, years before Thomas illegally drained my college fund to save his failing business, my grandfather officially placed the entire sprawling property directly into my name. He explicitly designated me as the sole legal beneficiary of the primary family residence. He did it to ensure I would always have a permanent, secure home away from her toxic manipulation. He wanted me to be completely untouchable. Catherine scrambled backward, shaking her head in frantic denial. She stammered that the document was completely impossible. She claimed the house belonged to her. She shrieked she had the official property records locked safely in her personal vault, proving her absolute ownership. She demanded I stop making up insane pathological lies to torment her. She violently accused me of fabricating a completely fake historical document just to torture her during her weakest moment. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical shrieking. I looked down at her with absolute clinical precision. I told her I knew exactly what kind of property record she was hiding in her vault. I explained that my grandfather's fatal mistake was leaving the execution of his final will to a supposedly neutral legal firm that Catherine had already successfully corrupted. When my grandfather died, Catherine discovered the existence of this exact document. She realized she was living in a mansion legally owned by the daughter she vehemently despised. Instead of honoring a dying man's final wish, Catherine committed a massive deliberate act of real estate fraud. She actively conspired with a compromised notary and a corrupt county clerk to completely forge a secondary set of property transfer documents. She illegally scrubbed my name from the municipal records and fraudulently registered the estate under her own personal trust. I dropped a thick, heavy stack of pristine white legal papers directly onto the polished mahogany table. I did not just quietly buy the expensive mortgage to the house to save it from absolute foreclosure. I officially restored the original deed today. The massive house is strictly mine. Legally, it always has been. Catherine stared blankly at the pristine white legal papers resting on the polished mahogany table. The absolute certainty of my words hung heavily in the sterile boardroom air, suffocating the very last remnants of her aristocratic pride. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled violently as she reached out to touch the heavy stock paper, as if expecting it to burn her skin. She read the bold legal print, confirming my absolute ownership of the generational estate. The massive, luxurious suburban mansion she had used to terrorize me for 18 years no longer belonged to her. Her grand fortress of social superiority had been entirely conquered without a single drop of spilled blood. Thomas slumped backward into his leather chair, looking physically ill. His shoulders caved inward, completely collapsing under the massive weight of his total financial ruin. In less than a single hour, he had lost his supply chain empire, his executive pension, his voting shares, and his untarnished public reputation. Catherine had lost her bottomless trust fund, her elite social standing, and her powerful high society allies. They were utterly destitute. They possessed absolutely no remaining leverage, no hidden corporate lifelines, and no wealthy friends willing to bail them out of their devastating criminal mess. I did not give them a single moment to catch their breath. I reached back into my sleek black briefcase and extracted one final manila envelope. I pulled out a single sheet of bright white paper printed with stark, unyielding black text. I slid the document across the long table until it bumped directly against Catherine's trembling hands. I informed them that they were officially holding a legally binding 24-hour eviction notice. I kept my voice perfectly flat and entirely devoid of any familial warmth. I told them that private security contractors would arrive at the wrought iron gates of the estate precisely at noon tomorrow. I explained that the perimeter locks the alarm codes and the gate access panels had already been remotely changed. I generously granted them exactly 1 day to pack their personal clothing and immediately vacate my property. I explicitly warned them that any designer furniture, expensive artwork, or high-end electronics they attempted to remove would be classified as grand theft. Anything left behind in the house after the noon deadline would be unceremoniously tossed into a rented industrial dumpster. Catherine let out a sharp, guttural gasp that sounded like a dying animal. She clutched her chest, rocking back and forth in the expensive leather chair. She wailed that I was a cruel, heartless monster. She demanded to know where they were supposed to go. She screamed that she could not possibly sleep in a cheap roadside motel like a common peasant. Thomas buried his face in his sweaty hands, entirely unable to offer his wife a single word of comfort or a viable financial solution. They were completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of their sudden poverty. Felicity watched her parents disintegrate before her very eyes. Her own desperate situation was rapidly becoming a catastrophic nightmare. Her husband was facing federal prison. Her wealthy in-laws had violently abandoned her to save themselves from massive tax evasion charges. Her parents were officially homeless and completely bankrupt. The limitless fountain of stolen trust fund money she used to finance her fake internet popularity was permanently shut off. She had absolutely nowhere left to run and nobody left to manipulate. Panic completely seized her features. Her breath hitched in her throat as she wildly scanned the boardroom looking for any possible escape route. She realized that her beauty, her charm, and her fabricated social media persona were entirely useless against cold, hard legal facts. She needed a trump card. She needed the ultimate emotional shield to force me to back down. Felicity suddenly dropped to her knees on the expensive boardroom carpet. She crawled toward the edge of the mahogany table, her ruined designer wedding dress pooling around her like dirty snow. She wrapped her arms tightly around her flat stomach, adopting a look of pure, vulnerable terror. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, forcing thick crocodile tears to stream down her cheeks. "Savannah, please," she begged, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. "Savannah, you cannot do this to me. You cannot throw us out onto the street. I have nowhere else to go. Spencer parents hate me now. I am completely alone. You have to let me stay in the house. Please, Savannah, I am begging you. I am pregnant." Catherine had snapped up her tear-stained face, shifting from absolute despair to sudden, desperate hope. Thomas lowered his hands, staring at his youngest daughter with wide eyes. Felicity rubbed her stomach, gently playing the role of the terrified, expecting mother to absolute perfection. She wailed that she was carrying an innocent child. She claimed the stress of the eviction would endanger the baby. She weaponized her supposed pregnancy, hoping my basic human decency would override my demand for absolute justice. She pleaded that I could not possibly make my future niece or nephew homeless. I looked down at her theatrical performance and felt an icy calm wash over my entire body. My mind instantly flashed back to the extravagant wedding reception just a few short hours ago. I vividly remembered standing in the grand ballroom surrounded by hundreds of mocking high society guests. I remembered the massive digital projector screen illuminating the darkened room. I remembered the specific cruel slide Felicity had proudly displayed for everyone to see. She had titled the slide, "The Barren Branch." She had completely violated my strict medical privacy, broadcasting my deeply personal struggles with reproductive health to a room full of arrogant strangers. She had displayed the word infertile in massive bold letters, laughing into the microphone, while the elite crowd chuckled at my agonizing pain. She had used my inability to conceive a child as a vicious punchline to elevate her own perceived perfection. She had tried to destroy my womanhood for cheap entertainment. Now, the exact same sister who publicly mocked my painful infertility was kneeling on the floor, desperately using a fabricated pregnancy as a pathetic human shield. I did not scream at her. I did not express an ounce of anger or outrage. I simply opened the heavy brass clasp of my leather briefcase one final time. I reached inside and pulled out a thick blue medical folder, clearly stamped with the official seal of a highly exclusive private fertility clinic located in downtown Chicago. I tossed the heavy folder onto the table. It landed with a loud, definitive smack right in front of Felicity. I told my sister she really should have paid much closer attention to her husband's financial records before she started funneling stolen trust fund money to pay off his violent loan sharks. I explained that when Vanguard Acquisitions initiated the hostile corporate takeover of Harrington Holdings, my forensic accounting team gained unrestricted access to every single hidden offshore account and private expenditure tied to Spencer's name. We uncovered a massive trail of highly confidential medical payments. I instructed Felicity to open the blue folder. I told her to look at the extensive medical history she somehow completely missed during her whirlwind romance with the supposed golden boy of the Harrington Empire. Felicity's hands shook violently as she reached up and pulled the blue folder off the table. She flipped it open, her eyes darting across the highlighted medical diagnostic reports. Catherine and Thomas leaned in, straining to read the complicated medical terminology printed on the pristine white pages. I delivered the ultimate truth with ruthless surgical precision. I informed them that Spencer Harrington was born with a severe congenital medical condition. The extensive clinical records definitively proved that he possessed an absolute zero sperm count. He had undergone multiple highly invasive experimental procedures over the past 5 years, desperately trying to reverse the diagnosis, but every single expensive treatment had completely failed. Spencer Harrington was completely, permanently, and medically sterile. He had been entirely sterile since the exact day he was born. Felicity's breath hitched sharply. The fake tears instantly dried up on her pale face. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She stared at the medical documents, unable to comprehend the absolute destruction of her final desperate lie. Her protective emotional shield had just been violently shattered into a million jagged pieces. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of the mahogany table. I looked directly into her terrified, panicked eyes. I asked her the only question that mattered. So whose baby is it, Felicity? The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute. Catherine gasped, covering her mouth in sheer horror as the devastating implication crashed into her mind. Thomas stared at his youngest daughter, his expression transforming from desperate hope to pure, unadulterated disgust. Felicity had not just lied about being pregnant to save herself from eviction. If she actually was pregnant, she had been sleeping with another man right before her extravagant multi-million-dollar wedding. Before Felicity could formulate a single pathetic excuse, a sudden sharp noise broke the suffocating tension. A heavy metallic object hit the polished hardwood floor just outside the boardroom entrance. It bounced twice, making a distinct ringing sound that echoed sharply through the quiet space. Every single person in the room instantly turned toward the open doorway. Spencer was standing directly in the threshold. He was flanked by two aggressive-looking corporate defense attorneys wearing sharp gray suits. His wealthy parents had clearly utilized their massive legal connections to temporarily pull him out of the federal holding facility for questioning. He wore the exact same expensive custom tuxedo from the wedding reception, but the jacket was heavily wrinkled and his silk tie was completely undone. He looked absolutely exhausted, his face pale and drawn from hours of relentless federal interrogation. But his dark eyes were wide awake and burning with an intense, furious fire. He was staring directly at Felicity. He had been standing quietly in the hallway listening to the entire devastating exchange. He had heard her desperate attempt to claim she was carrying his child. He had heard the irrefutable medical evidence proving his permanent sterility. He had heard the undeniable proof of her absolute infidelity. Spencer stepped slowly into the boardroom, his gaze locked entirely on his terrified new wife. The metallic object that had bounced on the floor rolled to a stop just a few inches from Felicity's knees. It was his heavy platinum wedding band. He did not yell. He did not throw a violent tantrum. He looked at the woman who had just publicly humiliated him and destroyed whatever tiny shred of pride he had left. He stated, his voice completely devoid of any warmth or affection, that he was filing for an immediate legal annulment based on severe fraudulent misrepresentation. He informed her that his legal team would be serving her the termination papers before she even left the building. He told her she was completely dead to him. Spencer turned on his heel without waiting for a single response. He marched right back out the door, his expensive defense attorneys following closely behind him. Felicity let out a horrifying guttural scream that tore through her throat. The reality of her absolute destruction finally broke her completely. She collapsed heavily onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably and clawing desperately at the carpet. She had lost her husband, her stolen wealth, her fake reputation, and her entire future in the span of a single afternoon. She was completely, utterly, and permanently ruined. I stood tall at the head of the boardroom table, watching my toxic family drown in the consequences of their own vicious actions. I gathered my documents, secured them safely in my briefcase, and prepared to leave them to their misery. The heavy mahogany boardroom doors clicking shut behind Spencer Harrington signaled the absolute and permanent end of the Vance family dynasty. Felicity remained a crumpled, sobbing mess on the expensive carpet, clutching her ruined designer wedding dress as if it could somehow shield her from the total devastation of her own making. The grand illusion of their flawless, elite existence had been surgically dismantled and reduced to ash. I stood calmly at the head of the long table, securing the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The suffocating tension in the room was entirely broken by the sudden jagged sound of genuine weeping. It was not the theatrical, manipulative sobbing Catherine had attempted just minutes earlier. It was the visceral, ugly sound of absolute defeat. Thomas Vance, the formerly terrifying corporate tyrant whose mere presence used to paralyze me with fear, slowly slid out of his high-backed leather chair. His knees hit the floor with a heavy thud. Catherine crawled over to him, clutching his arm. They knelt together on the floor, looking up at me with hollow, terrified eyes. The power dynamic that had defined my entire existence was completely permanently reversed. I was no longer the frightened, marginalized daughter, begging for scraps of basic human affection. I was the architect of their total destruction. Thomas looked up at me, tears carving wet tracks through the dust and sweat on his aging face. "Savannah, please." He choked out, his deep voice shattering into a pathetic, raspy whisper. "We are completely ruined. We have absolutely nothing left. Vanguard Acquisitions has dismantled my life work. The federal agents are seizing our bank accounts. We do not have the mansion. We do not have any allies. We are cornered like animals." He reached out a trembling hand toward me. "I am so sorry, Savannah. I am so incredibly sorry for everything I have ever done to you. I know I failed you terribly, and I regret every single choice I made." Catherine nodded frantically, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face in a tangled mess. "We were horrible parents, Savannah," she wailed, gripping her husband's shoulder. "We were monsters. We chose our public image and our wealthy social circle over our own flesh and blood. We let Felicity get away with everything because we were terrified of looking imperfect to our elite friends. We sacrificed your happiness to maintain a sick, superficial illusion. Please, Savannah, we are begging for your forgiveness. You are our daughter, and we desperately need you to show us some mercy." They both began speaking rapidly over one another, their desperate voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of sudden contrition. They swore they would completely change their toxic behavior. Catherine promised she would immediately enroll in intensive psychological therapy. Thomas swore he would spend the rest of his life making amends to me for draining my college fund and throwing me onto the street. They promised to finally be the warm, supportive, loving parents I had always desperately craved during my miserable childhood. They begged for a second chance to rebuild our family from scratch. I stood perfectly still, watching their pathetic display of sudden parental devotion. A younger, naive version of myself might have fallen for this desperate performance. A younger Savannah might have felt a spark of hope that her parents were finally capable of genuine, unconditional love. But the woman standing in this boardroom saw right through their tears. I looked into their panicked eyes and realized the absolute truth. Their intense remorse was not born out of sudden moral clarity or a genuine awakening of parental love. Their apologies were entirely manufactured by their sudden, crushing destitution. They were only apologizing because they were trapped. They only loved me now because I held the keys to their survival. They were terrified of the immediate consequences of their own incredibly greedy and malicious actions. If the forensic audit had failed, if the forged deed had remained hidden, if Spencer had never walked through those doors, they would still be laughing at me. They would have spent the rest of their lives happily dancing on my grave while spending the corporate funds they stole from innocent employees. I stepped away from the head of the table, walking slowly around the edge until I stood directly in front of my kneeling parents. I looked down at them, my expression completely devoid of any pity or hesitation. I did not scream or hurl insults. I spoke with the calm, chilling authority of a judge delivering a final, devastating verdict. My absolute composure terrified them far more than any violent outburst ever could have. "You do not want my forgiveness," I stated firmly, my voice cutting through their frantic apologies. "You want my money. You want my protection. You want me to wave a magic wand and make the federal investigators disappear so you can go back to pretending you are elite socialites. But that fantasy is permanently over. I am not your savior, and I am certainly not your daughter anymore. I am simply the executioner ending your reign." I reached inside the tailored breast pocket of my charcoal blazer. I pulled out a crisp, white envelope and held it up between my index and middle fingers. I stared at Catherine, forcing her to meet my gaze. I asked her if she remembered the exact night she and Thomas threw me out of the generational mansion. I described the freezing rain hitting my face as I stood on the grand marble porch with a single black garbage bag containing all my earthly possessions. I reminded her of the cruel smile on her face. "You stood in the doorway, wearing a cashmere robe, Catherine." I recalled my voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "You looked at me like I was a piece of trash infecting your pristine estate. You handed me a single piece of paper and told me I was entirely on my own. You told me never to embarrass the Vance family name again. You locked the massive front door directly in my crying face. Catherine squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks as the memory of her own vicious cruelty was weaponized against her. I knelt down slightly, placing the crisp white envelope directly onto the floor between Thomas and Catherine. I told them to open it. I watched them stare at it with absolute terrified hesitation. Thomas reached out with trembling fingers. He tore open the flap and pulled out the contents. He stared at the items completely confused. He was holding 3 one-way coach-class airplane tickets. I pointed to the destination printed in bold black ink on the boarding passes. I had purchased 3 tickets to a remote, decaying former mining town in rural North Dakota. It was a freezing, isolated, low-income community situated hundreds of miles away from the nearest luxury boutique or country club. It was a town where nobody cared about the Vance family legacy and nobody had ever heard of Harrington Holdings. I reached into my pocket one final time and pulled out my corporate checkbook. I uncapped a silver fountain pen and quickly wrote out a check. I tore it from the ledger and dropped it onto the pile of airplane tickets. I had written the check for exactly $200. It was the exact same pathetic amount they had handed me when they threw me into the freezing rain to starve. I stood back up, towering over my ruined family. I delivered my final unyielding ultimatum. "You have a choice to make right now," I announced, my voice echoing with terrifying finality. "Option 1 is right there on the floor. You take the tickets. You take Felicity, and you get on that commercial flight tonight. You take your $200 and you start your miserable lives over in a freezing trailer park where nobody knows your names. If you choose this option, I will let you vanish into total obscure poverty." Thomas and Catherine stared at the $200 check in absolute horror. Felicity finally stopped screaming and looked at the coach tickets, her face twisting in pure disgust at the thought of living in a rural trailer park. I took a step backward toward the boardroom doors. "Option 2, I continued, my tone dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper, "is that you reject my offer. You stay right here in Chicago. You try to cling to whatever pathetic delusion of high society you think you have left. If you choose option 2, you will stay in Chicago and face the relentless weight of the federal investigations I have catalyzed." I placed my hand securely on the heavy glass door handle. "The choice is yours," I stated calmly. "Take the $200 and the tickets to start over quietly far away from me, or stay in Chicago and face absolute total federal criminal ruin." Thomas stared at the cheap paper tickets lying on the polished mahogany floor. The crushing reality of his total defeat finally broke the last remaining shred of his toxic pride. His shoulders slumped forward and he slowly reached out with a trembling hand to pick up the coach boarding passes. He did not look at me. He simply clutched the $200 check and the tickets to his chest like a pathetic lifeline. Catherine let out a final defeated whimper, leaning heavily against her broken husband. Felicity sat frozen on the carpet, her ruined designer wedding dress pooling around her like a dirty, discarded shroud. She realized nobody was coming to save her. Spencer was completely gone. Her massive stolen trust fund was officially evaporated. She silently pushed herself off the floor and followed her ruined parents toward the heavy frosted glass doors. I stood in the doorway watching them shamble down the long corporate hallway. They looked entirely hollowed out, completely stripped of the vicious aristocratic arrogance that had defined their entire miserable existence. Less than 12 hours later, I stood on the grand marble portico of the Vance generational estate. The brutal Chicago wind whipped across the expansive manicured lawn, but I did not feel the cold. I watched a cheap dented compact rental car pull up to the front steps. The federal authorities had already seized their fleet of luxury vehicles. Thomas, Catherine, and Felicity emerged from the house carrying 3 small generic canvas duffel bags. They had been strictly forbidden from taking any expensive jewelry, designer clothing, or valuable artwork. The federal agents had cataloged every single item of worth inside the mansion. My parents wore incredibly basic, unbranded sweatpants and faded winter coats. Catherine's face was completely bare, devoid of her signature flawless makeup. Her expensive highlights already looked incredibly dull and lifeless. Thomas moved with a heavy, agonizing limp completely drained of his former terrifying corporate authority. Felicity dragged her feet, her head hung entirely in shame. She refused to make eye contact with me. They quietly loaded their meager, pathetic belongings into the tiny trunk of the compact car. There were no dramatic speeches. There were no final, vicious insults. They simply climbed into the cheap rental vehicle and drove slowly down the long, winding driveway. I watched the red taillights disappear through the heavy wrought iron gates. They were officially gone forever, banished to a freezing, isolated trailer park in rural North Dakota. I turned around and walked through the massive double doors of the generational estate. The sprawling foyer was incredibly quiet. The suffocating toxic energy that used to choke the very air inside this building was completely eradicated. I slowly walked across the pristine marble floors, my footsteps echoing cleanly off the high vaulted ceilings. I walked past the grand formal dining room where Catherine used to viciously critique my table manners. I walked past the heavy oak doors of the private study where Thomas used to explicitly tell me I would never amount to anything. I walked up the sweeping grand staircase, trailing my hand along the polished mahogany banister. I reached the exact spot at the top of the landing where Catherine used to stand and threaten to throw me out into the freezing rain. I stood there looking down at the magnificent empty foyer. I expected to feel a sudden surge of vindictive triumph. I expected to feel a massive rush of pure adrenaline, but I did not feel any of those things. Instead, a profound, absolute peace settled deeply into my bones. The heavy, agonizing weight I had carried tightly in my chest for 15 miserable years simply evaporated. The paralyzing childhood fear, the desperate craving for parental validation, the constant suffocating anxiety, it was all completely gone. I was standing inside the ultimate fortress of my childhood abusers, and I owned every single square inch of it. I had completely conquered the ghosts of my past. The house no longer represented fear or marginalization. It was just a building. It was just brick and wood and glass. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the fresh, untainted air of my brand new reality. I was completely unburdened. 6 months passed with the rapid, exhilarating momentum of a massive corporate victory. The bitter, freezing Chicago winter melted into a bright, vibrant spring. I did not move into the generational estate. I had absolutely no desire to live inside the hollow shell of my past trauma. Instead, I initiated a massive, aggressive architectural renovation. I completely gutted the toxic interior of the sprawling mansion and systematically transformed the entire property into something incredibly powerful. Vanguard Acquisitions officially launched the Vanguard Innovation Academy. I turned the massive, suffocating family estate into a state-of-the-art, high-tech educational facility and premium housing shelter strictly dedicated to supporting underprivileged girls. The grand formal dining room was completely ripped out and replaced with a massive, sleek coding laboratory filled with dozens of high-end computer stations. The expansive, perfectly manicured gardens where Catherine used to host her pretentious, elitist country club parties were transformed into sustainable agricultural learning centers. The dozens of empty, echoing guest bedrooms were converted into safe, warm, comfortable dormitories for brilliant young women who lacked a reliable family support system. I explicitly designed the academy for girls who had been abandoned, marginalized, or completely discarded by the people who were supposed to protect them. I built a sanctuary for girls who had been cruelly labeled as failures or disappointments. I poured millions of dollars into ensuring that no young woman walking through those wrought iron gates would ever have to face the terrifying prospect of homelessness or starvation. I hired the absolute best software engineers, financial analysts, and career mentors to provide them with a world-class education. I actively ensured that the toxic label of dropout would never be weaponized against any of them. The hallways that once echoed with Catherine's vicious aristocratic insults now vibrated with the brilliant, enthusiastic energy of future female executives coding complex algorithms and building their own unshakable empires. The dark, oppressive legacy of the Vance family was permanently overwritten by a blazing foundation of pure empowerment. I stood confidently on the expansive glass balcony of my luxury downtown Chicago penthouse. The warm evening wind rustled gently through my hair as I looked out over the glittering, sprawling city skyline. The towering skyscrapers glowed brightly against the dark night sky, representing the vast corporate landscape I had successfully conquered. Declan stepped out onto the balcony holding two crystal glasses filled with incredibly rare, expensive champagne. He wore a sharp, tailored suit, his expression completely relaxed and victorious. He handed me a crystal glass and gently clinked it against mine. He smiled warmly and announced that Vanguard Acquisitions had just officially closed another record-breaking fiscal quarter. He informed me that the integration of the dismantled Harrington Holdings assets was entirely complete, and our profit margins had completely shattered all previous industry expectations. We had systematically absorbed their massive rotting empire and turned it into an unstoppable financial juggernaut. Our corporate power was absolutely undeniable. I took a slow, appreciative sip of the crisp champagne, savoring the sweet taste of total victory. I reached into the pocket of my sleek silk trousers and pulled out my smartphone. The bright digital screen illuminated my face in the darkness. I had 3 new voicemails waiting in my inbox. The caller identification displayed a completely unrecognized phone number, originating from a remote rural area code in North Dakota. It was inevitably Thomas, or Catherine, desperately calling from a cheap prepaid burner phone, begging for money, pleading for a second chance, or violently demanding I rescue them from their freezing, miserable squalor. I did not listen to the messages. I did not even read the automated digital transcripts. I simply swiped my thumb across the glowing screen and permanently deleted the voicemails. I opened my security settings and systematically blocked the entire rural area code from ever penetrating my network again. I permanently severed the absolute final digital thread connecting me to my toxic past. I turned off the phone and slipped it smoothly back into my pocket. I leaned against the glass railing, looking down at the magnificent, bustling city, pulsing with beautiful, vibrant energy far below me. I had been thrown into the absolute lowest depths of poverty and despair. I had been burned by the vicious cruelty of the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I had been mocked, ridiculed, and discarded like absolute trash. But I did not just survive the brutal, consuming fire. I gathered the dark, smoldering ashes. I bought the ruined land they stood on. I built an absolute, unbreakable empire. I transformed my pain into undeniable, permanent power. I took a deep breath of the crisp city air, feeling the absolute, limitless potential of my future. I was completely free.